Hello, friends. Thank you again for coming to the Premature Bible Institute. My name is Doug Schaible, and just want to welcome you again to, we're kind of finishing up the second act of Joseph's life. And next week we'll bring this all into focus about how this all fits together. How does this deal with God's redemptive plan? And you'll see that as we come up next week. But for now, we need to continue on with the story because it's really, really an exciting one. I'm very appreciative of the example that Joseph gave to us. Now, just to kind of recap a little bit about what's happened to Joseph. Joseph, after he told his brothers those stories about those dreams that he had and what he thought of them, they were really upset with him. Of course, they had been upset with him his whole life. Jacob had made a coat of many colors for Joseph, and so they were jealous and they were angry at their brother, and so they decided that they were going to kill him, but they decided not to, and instead they sold him into slavery. Some Midianite traders were coming through, and they sold them Joseph, and Joseph was taken into captivity, and then they were on their way to Egypt, and then Joseph was sold to a captain of the Pharaoh's guard. His name was Potiphar, and he sold him into slavery to him. And Joseph ends up doing such a good job at managing his house that Joseph is promoted and made the head of that house. The only thing that was less powerful than Potiphar was just Joseph. The only one that was more powerful than Joseph was Potiphar. Let me put it that way. So, but as a result, it also makes a statement about Joseph. He says he was really a good-looking guy, and he was really well-built. I mean, he just looked good in form and everything. Everything about him looked good. He was the man of steel of his day. I mean, he just looked good. Like some of the actors do, like Thor and Superman. All those guys looking really, really good. That's kind of what he was like. And so I'm sure a lot of the women desired him and wanted him and whatever. And Potiphar's wife was one of those people, and she thought she had the right to tell him to do whatever he wanted. And she decided that she wanted to sleep with him, and that's what he said. No, yes, I can't do that. I can't sin against God or against my master. So he doesn't. And as a result of that, she falsely accuses Joseph to Potiphar that he had tried to rape her, basically. And so Potiphar is angry and throws him into prison, but I don't think he's so much angry at Joseph as he's angry he's lost this opportunity of having somebody that dependable, that faithful at doing what he did. Everything that Joseph touched turned out well. And so now he's lost this. And so Joseph goes into prison. He gets thrown into prison. But once again, remember, Potiphar didn't have him killed. And he put him into the best part of the prison where the king's, I wouldn't say enemies, but the king's prisoners went to for something that they had been done. So while he was in there, though, what happens is Joseph does what he does. He manages everything well. As a result, in the prison, the only one that was more powerful than Joseph was the captain of the prison there. And so Joseph once again rises to prominence and does a good job. And while he's in there, two men that were accused of something in Pharaoh's court, a baker and a cupbearer, were brought in, and while they were there, and Joseph was managing that portion of the prison and taking care of them, they both had dreams, and they were talking about it, and Joseph heard it, and so Joseph interpreted those dreams for him. Now, Joseph would be the first to tell you it wasn't him. It was God who interpreted, and he just gave it to Joseph what to tell them. And Joseph told them that in 3 days, both of them would be released after he interpreted their dreams. The only difference is one would be brought back into Pharaoh's court, the other would be hung by the neck. And so that's exactly what happened. 3 days later, one died, the other one was reinstated as to what had happened. So he interprets those dreams while he's in there, and then he tells that, not the baker, but the cupbearer, he says, listen, remember me when you go back to Pharaoh's court. He says, I've been wrongly accused for being here. Please remember me. Well, the guy goes back to Pharaoh's court and kind of forgets all about it. He's probably tickled to death to be where he's at, and he thought, man, he's just a Hebrew slave. What difference does it make if he stays there longer? So he stays in there 2 more years, and then one night, Pharaoh himself has some dreams, and he has 2 of them. And so he's really troubled by that, and he calls all the magicians and the sorcerers and whatever in his kingdom to come and interpret this dream, and nobody can. Nobody knows what it is. They can't figure it out. And so he just didn't know what to do. And then all of a sudden, the cupbearer says, "Oh man," basically, like I said last week, "my bad." He says, "I forgot. There is a Hebrew slave in the prison." He says, "When we were in prison, myself and the baker," he says, "this is what he told us, and it came to pass exactly as he said it would." And so they said, I never seen anything like this. And so Pharaoh says, "Okay, call this guy. I want him to come in and do the same thing for me." So let's just read a little bit of that story again and just to remind us. In Genesis chapter 41, verses 8 through 15, it says, "Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled," talking about Pharaoh. "And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody of the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each dreamed a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. And each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So this is how it starts out. Pharaoh says, I've heard that you can interpret dreams. And so that's where we left off. So what happens after this? Well, here's what Joseph's response is. And I think this is really telling. In 41 verse 16, it says this. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So you see already right off the bat, even in front of a person who could kill him, he says, it isn't going to be me that's going to be doing this. God himself will give you a dream, or give you the interpretation of that dream. So he's giving God the credit, even right there in the face of adversity. He wasn't trying to take credit for himself, and if he did, he probably would never have got the interpretation. So Joseph didn't take credit for the interpretation. Joseph did not fear Pharaoh. He feared the Lord. And by fear, I don't mean he was scared of God in the sense like you and I are thinking. He respected, he honored, it was unthinkable for him to do anything that was something that God wouldn't want him to do. So, and also the third thing, it would be an answer that would satisfy Pharaoh. So that's pretty interesting. So how does it go? What does Joseph tell him? And here it is in Genesis chapter 41, verses 25 through 37. Kind of a long passage here. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. Now, remember last lesson I talked about this. I need to back up just a second. And it talked about those, the dream, what they were about the 7 good cattle and the 7 grains, and how there were 7 good heads of grain, there were 7 good cattle, but the 7 bad grain ate up the good grain, the 7 bad cattle ate up the good cattle. And please go back and read that again and refresh your mind of it. But anyway, here he's telling what the interpretation of it is. Anyway, let me start again. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. So he's telling him, says, this is what's going to happen. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all of the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. So can you imagine all these people? They're sitting there listening to all this, and they're saying, whoa, man, I mean, they had to be blown away. They were just sitting there thinking, wow, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, here this kid from I wouldn't say from Israel, because there's only about 70 people in the land of Jacob, or in the family of Jacob at this point. But this Hebrew kid, he's saying these things, and they're just blown away. And they're looking, and they're all very impressed. Not only the people around him, but Pharaoh and everybody. And the one thing that they knew right at that particular point was he wasn't buttering up to Pharaoh, because if he was, he would have said whatever he would have wanted to make Pharaoh like whatever he had to hear. But to tell him about the 7 bad years, that was not something that somebody would want to hear. But he says, I have to tell the truth. And that's what made it authentic. And see, that's the thing I believe a lot of times with us as believers and so on. It's when we're authentic that people really appreciate it. When we can tell when people really believe what they believe, and whether people are just saying what they think, but rather what does their life show as a result of that. So Joseph, there were some things here. Joseph could only tell Pharaoh what God had told him. That was Joseph's mindset. I can't tell him something on my own. I have no authority to know what the future is going to be. Only God does. He dwells in eternity. See, that once again, there's that aspect of Joseph. He trusts God because he knows who God is. And if God is an eternal God, then he already knows what's going to happen. So I'll trust him and let him be the one to decide. And Egypt would see that God was indeed God. And that's something that's going to happen. And Egypt would see that they would survive because Joseph believed God. Okay? So that's pretty interesting. I can't even imagine the credibility that Joseph must have had no matter where he went. And that was pretty interesting. So what was the result of Joseph's interpretation? So he stands before Pharaoh. He could have been killed right on the spot for saying what he did. He could have been sent back to prison, whatever. Pharaoh says, hey, forget that. But what does Pharaoh do? What does he do as a result of hearing this interpretation of the dream? And by the way, I want to mention something too. Notice it said that it happened twice. So Pharaoh had 2 dreams. And you remember, Joseph had 2 dreams also. And so what was the thing? Why did he have 2 dreams? Because he says, when God gave him 2 dreams, that was God telling you that this thing is sure. It's going to happen. And you know what? It's the interesting thing, isn't it? Joseph's 2 dreams said the same thing. And so we'll see what happens as a result of that. So anyway, in Genesis 41, verses 38 through 41, it says this, And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the 2nd chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, Bow the knee. And so he set him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. And he gave him as a wife Asenath, however you pronounce it, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was without number. So as Joseph said in the first part of that prophecy and that interpretation of a dream, the 7 years of plenty. And there was so much grain, so much produce that you just couldn't even count. As a matter of fact, there came a point where he quit counting. There was just so much. So what they did is they just started gathering all of this up and storing it up, because they knew that the day, or at least Joseph knew that the day was coming. And they could almost count what years, well, they could count how many years it was going to be, and things would start getting bad. Now, God was taking care of Joseph throughout all of this ordeal. So it was God's outcome, wasn't it? God wanted this to happen. The outcome would always be known, because God is omniscient and eternal, like I said before. God knew what was going to happen. Why? Because he's an eternal God. He is in the future. Take that back. He is the future. So he's there. And he's omniscient. He knows everything there is to know. There's nothing he can be taught. So he knew what was going to happen. Another thing, too, is that the outcome would always be good. Why? Because God is good. God was doing this for a reason. And there wasn't just that he was sitting there thinking, oh, man, I don't know what to do about this. We better start storing up. God has a purpose in all of this, too. And the timing is always going to be right, because God is perfect. God does everything in a proper time and decently in order. Remember back in the beginning when we talked about the creation of the physical world, how everything was done decently and in order, and everything was done at the proper time. It didn't get mixed up and didn't get just messed up or anything like that. God had everything done the way it should be done. So through this story, we're going to learn an awful lot about Joseph, but we're also going to learn an awful lot about God. God sees the end from the beginning, and Joseph understood that. Joseph didn't have to know what the end was. Joseph all he had to do was know who God is. And the God who is will take care of the God who will, or the situations that will be. So it was just an exciting thing there. Now, seeing Joseph wrong, sold, enslaved, slandered, and elevated to the position of second in command of the most powerful army on earth is an amazing story of God's care and sovereignty. So here he is. Joseph was wronged by his brothers. He was sold by his brothers. He was enslaved by his brothers and the Midianite traders. Then he was slandered by Potiphar's wife. And then he was elevated to the position of second in command in all of Egypt. Can you imagine this? Second in command of the most powerful country on earth. And it's just, like I said, it's an amazing story of the goodness of God and his sovereignty, that God is the sovereign. He will take care of things, and he's working out things according to his plan. And so it's just really neat how he's being part of that. So what does this story have to do with the dreams back when he was in his homeland, and about the sheaves and the sun, the moon, and the stars? About the sheaves bowing down to Joseph, and the sun, the moon, the stars bowing to Joseph. What does this story have to do with this? Well, this story that we're doing today, this finishes the second act of Joseph's life. The third act is getting ready to begin, and that's what we're going to carry on with that next week. It's an important thing. All of this isn't just a good story. There's a point to it, and there's a purpose to it. And that's what we're going to just tie in next week, and we'll see, wow, that's our God. So anyway, just want to say thank you again for listening this week. Be sure to join us next week. And once again, like I say, if you enjoy this, tag a friend, let them know about it. Tell them to start at the beginning. Have them subscribe to my site. Like I say, it doesn't obligate them to anything. It just lets them know that whenever I put out a new one, they'll just get a notification that it's there. And I've also got a couple other aspects, playlists on my site. my YouTube site that also talks about, thoughts on cross-cultural church planting, which I'm starting to build on that, and then also videos of tribal testimonies about things. So just please do that. And if you want to listen to this on a podcast, just please do that. Get on your favorite podcast and look up Premature Bible Institute and subscribe to it, and you'll get the podcast every week too. So remember, just look up on YouTube, just look up Doug Schaible, D-O-U-G, and then my space, and then Schaible, S-C-H-A-I-B-L-E. And we'll talk to you next week, and thanks for listening in. Bye.